Can you do the first 2 minutes? Can you do the first minute, introduce, and then I'll.
You want me to do the introductions?
Well, no, or whatever. Yeah, whatever.
No, I don't want to do that.
You could say welcome to the FCCT.
No, you start.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. On a rainy Monday night, I'm so grateful that we have the committed and the confirmed members of the club and members of Democrats Abroad Thailand are also welcome. There has recently been a US midterm election. And that is the topic for tonight's discussion and event. We will be joined by Zoom by Professor Wendy Schiller of Brown University on the left. We are also joined by, we could hold our applause till the end of this, please. We are also joined by Mr. Rob Werner of the League of Conservation Voters. And Rob is joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh at the current COP27 climate change negotiations. And last but not least, we are joined by former Ambassador Robert Fitz, a longtime Thai resident, and very much somebody with an observer's appreciation of US foreign policy in Southeast Asia and around the world. So, without further ado, I hope that we're all interested in getting right to the meat of the subject. What happened last Tuesday in America? And why did it happen? And how do we move forward from the election results that we did see? So I would like to start, without further ado, with Professor Schiller. Wendy, take us away.
Okay, my sound is good. It's a long way away.
Yes.
Well, good morning for me, good evening for you. So what happened? The Democrats, this is a succinct version, and then I'm sure we'll get into more specifics. I do think it would be good to go through some of the exit poll dating, because it's sort of good signs for the Democrats and then some bad signs leading into 2024. But Democrats just overperformed in terms of turnout. I mean, that's just the bottom line. We know in midterm cycles that Republicans get out the door. We know that even when there's a Republican president and there's a bit of backsliding or the Democrats capture a lot of seats like 2006 or 2018, it takes a very, very unpopular Republican president to produce a real big Democratic wave in the midterms. But Democratic presidents tend to suffer, at least in the modern age, post 1994, and I can explain why I think that happens. But Republicans generally tend to get out the door more. So the anticipation was that Democrats were a bit demoralized, even though 76% of Democrats were happy with Biden. 76% is not the usual 89 or 90% that Republicans generate when they're presidents in the White House, when they're party president. But nonetheless, it's a pretty decent number. But the concern was that with inflation, the economy, things that were pounded into people, even though we're not in a recession in the United States right now, we have historic unemployment, somewhere around between 3.5 and 3.7%. It stayed very steady for a long time. And we have no signs that consumers are sort of pulling back on their spending. But nonetheless, the idea of a recession looming, was sort of going to demoralize Democrats, but really energize and engage Republicans. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen. The media narrative is that it didn't happen because of abortion, and it didn't happen because of, sort of extremist candidates that were nominated, particularly for governor and for U.S. senator by the Republicans. That's not a national explanation. That explanation accounts for, many of the states that we've all been watching where there was contested access to abortion, for example, like Michigan, and when there was an extreme right-wing candidate, I would argue, in Pennsylvania running for governor. But it was also smart candidate selection on the part of the Democrats. So as much as people focus on the bad candidate selection for the Republicans, there was sort of really strong, particularly Gretchen Whitmer running for re-election in Michigan, and Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, which was a very, very important pickup for the Democrats in the governor's office. He was attorney general. Attorney generals do better in the Democrat Party when they run for governor. Maura Healey in Massachusetts, albeit a Democratic state, was elected the first female governor in Massachusetts from the position of attorney general, and she replaced a Republican governor. So when you think about the dynamics and the narrative, what it demonstrates is the variation across the United States in political climate, in what voters are looking for in their candidates, and how specific states have reacted both to the abortion decision, Dobbs' decision by the Supreme Court in June, but also to the persistence of the Trump right wing of the Republican Party. And so I'm hopeful we can get into more details of that in the conversation.
Great. I have so many questions I want to ask you right away, but let's hope we can hear from Rob Warner. Can you give us a few of your takeaways from the election?
Sure. So as Wendy was pointing out, under traditional sort of measures, this should be been a very bad year for Democrats. I had 8% inflation, wrong track, right track number, wrong track number very high. I think at one point I saw a poll that said that 80% of the American respondents in this poll said that they were negative on the economy. So you would expect, as many Republicans were trumpeting and expecting, that they were going to have a big night, and they did not, because there were other issues that were pushing against that. Primarily the overturning of Roe with the Dobbs decision. I think there seemed to be a lot of commentators who, towards the last couple of weeks of the election, were trying to make the point that, well, this is an important issue. It's not as important as economics, and maybe it's fading as an issue. And I think on election night, it was, in my mind, it was proven that was actually not true. Certainly not true in New Hampshire, where I live. We can talk about that a little bit. And also, I think the concern about democracy and our institutions, I really do think that had an impact towards the end in terms of when people were really focusing on it. And I think that Trump's constant injection of himself, and really for himself, in these elections did produce a bit of a backlash, particularly on the Democratic side, or on the sort of protection of democracy side, because it reminds people what they don't like about the guy. So I really think that that had a big impact. Young people did turn out. The independents, it was interesting, and I'm sure Wendy talked about getting into some of the exit polling. There was a group of people who were like meh on Biden, and not strongly opposed necessarily, but kind of, I don't know. And those people actually voted Democratic by some point. So it was a very unusual election in the terms of what we have experienced in the recent past, when you have a president that has an approval rating in the mid to in the low to mid 40s. In New Hampshire, you might remember that Leader McConnell was complaining in the summer about candidate quality, and that certainly was true in New Hampshire. And it shows you a bit where the party is, I think, in New Hampshire and in other places, where clearly the folks who came out of crowded primaries in New Hampshire were the most MAGA. You had to be the most MAGA. You had to get to that rail on the far right side to get that primary. And, you might win your primary by, with 30% of the vote, but you are the nominee. And I think those candidate quality issues certainly had a big impact in New Hampshire. The other thing that's interesting, I'd like to really learn more about this. I've been talking to some friends of mine who are in the polling industry or really keep an eye on polling and numbers, very good with numbers over a period of time. And they have a theory that there were pollsters, even pollsters who have Democratic candidates as clients, who were adjusting their models because they were burned in 16 and 20 in terms of what the polling said and what the outcomes actually were. So maybe they were overcompensating. In New Hampshire, for example, The final polls showed a toss-up race in the first CD with Chris Pappas and Caroline Leavitt, the most MAGA candidate. You had a dead heat race with Maggie Hassan and Don Bolduc, who only weeks before our governor, Chris Sununu, who was reelected, warned that if Bolduc won the nomination, the seat was gone. He was certainly correct, because in all of those races, the Democrat won by 10, in Maggie Hassan's case, 10 points, and Chris Pappas's case, 7 points, and the other district where I live, CD2, Annie Custer beat her opponent by 8 points. So I really have a question about polling. I wonder if polling in some ways is a broken industry as far as candidates go, and I'm kind of wondering how it might fare better in terms of issues and learning what people care about rather than horse race stuff. So right now, we have the Senate in Democratic control, 50-50. We have a runoff in Georgia, and I would expect that the enthusiasm of the Republicans in Georgia is going to wane, because it just doesn't matter as much as it would if it would be, determining Senate control. So I do expect that Senator Warnock will win that race, and the Senate, and then it will be 51-49. In the House, still a lot of toss-up races to be decided. My own prediction, I think it should be like 219, 216, or maybe 220, 215 at the end of the day, which is obviously far below what the Republicans are expecting, and it's going to create tremendous headaches for Speaker McCarthy, assuming that he is Speaker, and that's an open question as well.
I'm fascinated by all of those different issues you bring up. But first, let's hear from Ambassador Fitz, if you have some sense of the view from abroad of the US election that just took place.
Okay, I had prepared a bit of an academic lecture, and I'll try to skip through this pretty quickly to get to some of the points they raised. First, as they said, it's now 50-49, and we're waiting for the Georgia runoff. I'll disagree a little bit with Don. Oh, by the way, I'm also from New Hampshire, born and conquered. But the Republicans have done fairly well in the 13 previous runoffs they've had in Georgia. And we'll see how motivated the Democrats get. I suspect is if we think will happen, Trump will announce his candidacy tomorrow. That will motivate Democrats, and so that may redo it. But I think that race still is up now. And again, on the House, there's 20, I gather, about roughly 20 seats that haven't yet been called, and the Republicans only need, need 6 seats, whereas the Democrats would need 14. But of those 20, 10 seem to be a little bit in the Democrat lead right now. Republicans have the edge. So I suspect we're going to do what Don was saying, and we'll be looking at a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. A couple of points to make. And again, along with what Don was saying, the candidates matter. This slide, which I don't know if you can see, but shows split tickets that in many states around the country, people would vote for one party for one office. This is governor, Senate, and another party for the other. They're really we're looking at the candidates, and the vote totals were quite different. So there were a lot of mail-in ballots, and split tickets were important this time. To put things in context, the standard in a normal by-election, midterm election, where you not have a president running, the office of the party that has the presidency loses 29 House seats on average, and loses 4 Senate seats. So this performance by the Democrats' record in this election is the best for Democrats since JFK in 1962. And this shows the same results in the Senate. Again, Don was talking about the pollsters. They got it wrong. This is the best example I could find from the website 538, which digests hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of polls, then runs a simulation. This isn't the percentage of the vote that was going to go. It's what percentage, the odds, what they think the odds are, showing that the Republicans had overwhelming favorites to win the House, and were pretty strong favorites, 60-40 to win the Senate. And again, that didn't happen. So along with the polls and the candidates, the Republicans were counting on, a lot of my Republican friends were very, very happy going into this election. They thought they're going to do very well. That did not happen. Again, just perhaps a little bit too academic, but the elections in the United States are won in swing and battleground states. In actual terms, in this election, the political scientists said 83% of the seats were basically taken by one party or the other. And this shows the difference in votes between the election and then the primary. So if you have a state that is, say, Republican and is going to have a Republican senator or a Republican governor, who that's going to be is decided in the Republican primary. And 28 states don't allow open primaries. It's only members of the party can vote. So if you crunch the numbers, it turns out that roughly 10% of the voters in the United States choose a supermajority, 83% of who's going to be in the Senate, who's going to be in the State House. The blurb asked that, let me get to my notes so I get this right, asked us to talk about what the issues were. Well, I can't find it in my notes immediately, but the top issues for the Republicans were the economy, crime, and immigration. The top issues for the Democrats. This was a comprehensive poll taken 1 week before the election, and the top issues for the Democrats were the future of democracy, health care, and abortion. And that's what the Democrats voted on. So there's a myriad of other issues we could go through. But just to sum up what's happening, many people say that they don't think Trump will announce tomorrow. He's teased that he's going to announce tomorrow. I suspect his ego is strong enough that he would be seen. It would seem weak to him to back off, so he will announce. If he announces, then that turns we skip to President Biden, who definitely should feel vindicated by this election, but that vindication, actually, if you tear it apart, is much because of Trump looming in the background as anything Biden did. As I said, his approval rating is only 41.5%, which is lower than at this point in his presidency than all 13 presidents back to World War II. Albeit only slightly lower than what President Trump was at this point in his election. So the question is, what will President Biden do? Will he decide that he's going to run? I don't think we'll know anything until at least the State of the Union, and we can chat about where that will leave us. I've got some notes we could talk about, but I don't think I'll do it. But if he does choose to run, we end up with the Democrats and the Republicans both with a millstone perhaps around their neck. because most presidencies lose, their approval rating goes down. Some don't, but it's going to be a difficult row to hoe. What's going to happen in Washington is, now that President Biden has the Senate, he will be able to appoint members of his cabinet, pass treaties, and more importantly, appoint judges. He's been appointing at roughly the rate, judges at, I think he's 84 so far. This is roughly the same rate that Trump was appointing at this point in his presidency. And so that important work will continue for the Democrats. But the House will, I can wrap it up pretty quickly. I better.
Yeah, but I want you to save a lot of this ammunition for the questions.
Sure.
Because we want to ask you your opinions on these.
Okay, and let me just say that the House is going to be a serious problem. The last two Republican leaders in the House resigned in disgust, and Speaker Boehner afterwards talked about some of the members of the Republican caucus, specifically the Freedom Caucus, as he said, they're just anarchists. All they want to do is tear things down. They're impossible to work with. Well, there's 43 of them. Maybe there'll be 220 Republicans. 43 of them any 5 of those could hold the key to McCarthy being the speaker. They will have him hostage. So the outlook will be I think, for investigations, Hunter Biden's laptop, Hillary's emails, repudiating the January 6th committee, and all sorts of other things that will perhaps entrance Washington, but may not play that well with the electorate. With that said, I have thoughts on relations in Asia and relations with Thailand, but we'll leave that for the question period.
Yeah, let's get that in the second round. Great, thank you very much. We've heard from all 3 of our speakers tonight, and I'd like to get to a round of questions, and we have a microphone set up in the back of the room. As moderator, I get to ask the first question. Professor Schiller, I know that you have to leave shortly for your class, so we have oodles of questions that we're ready to ask you. Some of the questions, Ambassador Fitz sort of spilled the beans on some of them, but I still want you to think of these issues. The number one issue in my mind is, as Americans abroad, all of the people in this room for decades have been dealing with absentee ballots, with getting registrars by email or by phone, with filling out pieces of paper, mailing it in, never knowing whether our votes are counted or not. The one benefit of COVID and the 2020 election was that all Americans suddenly became used to using mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, voting in different ways than we have done in the past. So the big question to you is it easier now to vote than it has been in the past? Has voter turnout increased? What did we see in this midterm election that gives you hope for the logistics of democracy and for future elections as well?
Oh, those are big questions. So just really quickly about voting. So voting by mail has certainly become easier across the whole country. So it used to be, in my own state of Rhode Island, you needed an excuse. You need to say, this is why I won't be here to vote in person, or for the sort of early voting period that we have in Rhode Island, in order to get a mail-in ballot. But now we have no excuses mail-in ballot. You just get a mail-in ballot if you need it. But it's becoming much more popular across the whole country. The West has led the way. We saw that, excuse me, in Colorado and Nevada in 2020 in terms of using mail-in balloting and joining the ranks. But Arizona, the vast majority of people in Arizona actually vote with what you would call an absentee ballot. They may drop it off at the Board of Elections or drop it off in a drop box, but they actually use that sort of form of voting. What's changed in 2022 is that Republicans voted early in person more than they did in 2020. Obviously, the pandemic may have something to do with that, but they also voted by mail. in states that you didn't have another option, but even when it was accessible. So this gap between Democrats and Republicans in terms of who uses vote by mail and vote early, in some states like Pennsylvania was vastly favored towards the Democrats. But in other states like Arizona, the reason we don't know who the governor is yet is because a lot of Republicans voted by mail technically, but dropped their ballot off on election day. And a lot of states don't start counting those what we call absentee mail ballots, until the day of the election or even after the election, the polls close. So it's going to take a lot longer to know who wins elections in America. And we did see turnout pretty high, not quite as high as 2018, but in the low mid 40s, 43, maybe 44% turnout, which was very high. I think for a lot of people thinking that it was going to be a lower turnout election, at least among Democrats. So I think it is easier theoretically because the mechanism of voting has opened up. You can vote early, you can vote by mail, but it's still hard to vote in America. You should have to register to vote. You have to prove your identity and your address. And you have, to get your ballot, to register to vote, you have to register to vote in advance of both the primary and the election. And most people don't know these deadlines. They just don't know the deadlines. And, it's very cumbersome. Voting by mail. Mail ballots get disqualified if you've done something wrong. Now, if your ID information is okay, and your address is okay, and the ballot itself is okay, they then will cure it, meaning they'll just check to see that you're who you are and you can vote, and then it will vote, and it will count. But we won't know that for, a couple of days after the election. So any mistakes can be, invalidate your absentee ballot. And frequently, as it did in Pennsylvania and Georgia, take a judge to say, no. You can give the Board of Elections time to cure these ballots and make sure this person's vote is counted. But the Republicans wanted to toss out a number of votes in different places from mail-in ballots. So I think that's the big problem, is actually it's quite cumbersome. People are overcoming those obstacles, but it's still too cumbersome.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. Rob, how do you vote in New Hampshire?
Well, we do not have early voting in New Hampshire, but we do have same-day registration, which is highly significant.
Okay.
We always have long lines of people at every polling place in the municipality in New Hampshire registering to vote on election day. And, some elections have had the dynamic of students voting in places like Hanover and Durham and Plymouth and Keene. And it's been really significant. I would say that, Maggie Hassan, when she was elected the first round, she won her race out of 1,016 votes, or 17 votes. I want to get the number right, 1017, out of 750,000 cast. And it was those college towns that put her over the top, no question. So there's been in New Hampshire a push to really have students not vote in state elections, but it's been largely unsuccessful. But those efforts still exist. So we have very high we had a record turnout in New Hampshire. We traditionally have high turnout, both in our presidential primary, our state primary in general. And people are enthusiastic about voting. I'd say it's relatively easy to vote in New Hampshire, even though we don't have early voting. But you go to your town or you register the day of.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump back.
Go on.
Yeah.
One thing real quick is that, we do want people. People need to show their ID, but if they don't have their ID with them, then they sign an affidavit, and they have to prove some days after they'll get a letter from the Secretary of State that it is indeed you. But there's that option. So I think it's relatively easy.
Yeah, Rob, I just wanted to say that for us, those of us, we live, you live in New Hampshire, I live in Rhode Island. One of the things that people who, are outside the states or don't know about American politics is that region and culture matter a great deal. And the New England area has been very resistant over time to early voting and mail voting, partly because we're small, most of us, New Hampshire and Vermont are bigger geographic states, but we're small population states generally. And it comes from the 1600s, 1700s idea of local government, in-person deliberation, town councils, really sort of town government, and you have to show up to be part of that government. And so all of New England states have been much more resistant to a lot of those opening up of male opportunities than the whole rest of the country. And that's because of these original traditions about politics, participating in politics. So that's all I wanted to jump in and two finger on what Rob said.
Okay, now we have a question from the floor.
My name
Jeffrey?
is Jeff. I'm from New Jersey. I'll try not to act like somebody from New Jersey. Rob, my question is for you. You made a comment about younger people and that they voted a lot in this election. I believe it was lower than the presidential election. And I think one of our problems is I have two stepsons, and they don't vote. Okay, one is 30, one is 28, and I speak to them all the time about the importance of it. And they basically say, there's no reason for us to vote. Okay, so I don't know if we're doing as good a job with younger people for giving them some motivation to vote. I definitely know they lean Democrat, and they're our future, but I don't know what we can do about that.
Well, it may get to a larger question of disaffection and efficacy and how they see, like, what has it done for me in my life? That's a larger question. I mean, young people did turn out in this election, certainly not at the same level as the presidential election, but it was pretty healthy, and it had an impact on these races, Generation Z in particular, in terms of turnout. 18, 29-year-olds, it was significant. So, and then, you know, my own observation around New Hampshire on election day. You know, I should just tell you that the League of Conservation Voters, if you don't know, we get very involved in elections. We do a lot of policy work, obviously, at the federal and state level around climate and clean energy. But we pay a lot of attention to elections, and we invest in candidates that we support, and we try to defeat those who do not share our values. And we had field programs in New Hampshire. Our folks are flipped over into the coordinated campaign. Our staff, full-time staff of 10 here in New Hampshire, including myself, working out of the coordinated campaign offices, working specifically with our members, a lot of whom are young and on college campuses, to get them out to vote. And I saw a lot of effectiveness with those field programs. As I said, I really do think it had a significant effect on this election. I just think that, and I've been doing some reading about this, I've seen reports about this, that, you know, given the fact that we are so divided in our politics, we're so tribal, that actually drives voter turnout. People are very much on their team and want their team to win. So we had high turnout in 18, we had high turnout in 20, we had high turnout in 22. I fully expect we'll have high turnout in 2 years from now. Significant, may even break another record. But people, in their minds have been concentrated in the midst of all this division.
Wow, very good. Okay, let's take a couple of more questions, and then let's take a look at foreign policy after we exhaust this one more. Okay, we have a representative of the AOC wing of the Democratic Party. And believe me, for most Americans abroad, the AOC wing is our wing. Bernie Sanders won overwhelmingly in most of the primaries that were held by Democrats abroad in 2020 and in 2016. So Andy, ask your question.
Well, not only the AOC wing, but also a Fetterman voter, so you're welcome.
Oh, Pennsylvania, right?
I don't know if this was touched on before. I apologize. I just ran out of the room earlier. My niece is at University of Virginia, and there was a shooting there this morning. 3 people dead, and I was just running out to call my brother and see if she's okay.
Wow. Okay.
And no news yet, so I'm a little bit anxious at the moment. So, apologies if this has been covered yet, but yeah, speaking of the AOC wing of the party, as Paul said, the left of the party is well represented abroad. It also seems that the left of the party is treated with outright hostility by the rest of the party, also in the media. You will get interviewers on so-called left-wing media trying to embarrass, discredit, drag down people on the left when they interview them, and they give softball questions to people in the so-called center of the party and allow them to just get away with idiotic policies that deserve questioning and never get questioned. And I was saying to Paul earlier today, this is a very long-winded question, I apologize, but if you look at things like the policies that the left support, the AOC wing, you don't have a policy with less than 50% support in the country, which makes the left wing of the Democratic Party the center of the country, and anything to the right of that is extreme. So to call people who support policies with 50, 60, 70, 80% left-wing extremists, that's got to stop. You've got to get the media to stop it. You've got to get the party to stop it. What is going to be done to embrace the fact that the left is what's handing you elections, and you treat the left with complete disdain at the party level? What's going to be done to stop that? Because if you don't embrace the left at the party level, the party's finished. Well, the question is, what's going to be done to embrace the policies of the left when the policies of the left have not only majority but supermajority support across the country? There is not a single not a single left-wing policy that does not have majority support in the country, and yet the left of the party is called extreme. What's going to be done to change that and to make people wake up to the fact that you look at Biden's student loan forgiveness, he's plummeting in the polls, and he shoots up 10% the second he does something Bernie Sanders told him to do. Student loan forgiveness gave him a 10% bump in the polls. That's a left-wing policy. Left-wing policies are popular. They are going to win elections. When is the party going to wake up to that?
Well, I'm not sure if our panelists can look into the crystal ball that accurately, but please, Professor Schiller, Rob, give it a shot. So.
Well, I'm going to just put something in the chat, which I think would people who, in response to the questioner's point, from Chris Murphy, who just wrote a pretty, I would argue, interesting, I think it's pretty smart, column in essay in The Atlantic on this exact point that the questioner is raising, which is that the Democrats, so there's two dimensions here. It is the messengers of the quote unquote left, and I think the left is multi-dimensional. I think you are correct to say that party policies that the Democratic Party is espousing in general are popular. I think some of the more targeted policies, like student loan forgiveness, are popular among families and people who've got student loans. I don't think they're unpopular. They're popular. 60% of America doesn't go to college. So it's not that you shouldn't support these policies if you're a Democrat. It's that you can't win necessarily everybody over on this particular policy because it simply doesn't affect 60% of Americans and American families. But what Chris Murphy, and what I put in the chat, he gave a talk a couple weeks ago at Brown. He's a Democratic senator from Connecticut. He says exactly to your point, the core weakness of the Democratic establishment or the center is that it does not pay enough attention to income inequality, economic opportunity, and other alternative forms of educational opportunity, that it is not meeting the needs of low-income and working families. And it's not messaging in there, and it's not meeting the needs, and it's not making the government structure that it has in place work effectively enough. So if AOC wants Medicare for all, you still have to make Medicare and Medicaid work well. And Medicare works a little bit better than Medicaid, but Medicaid, the low-income insurance for the poor and low-income families, about 138% of poverty in a lot of states, is a disempowering experience, it's a limiting experience, it's hard to navigate, and a lot of states are restricting eligibility. So these core things that make or break people's lives are things that the Democrats either don't message well on, don't run well enough on, don't run the programs well enough, or don't give enough attention to. So I think precisely to your point, I wouldn't use the broadest brush strokes, the left, the extreme, the left. I would sort of focus more on some of these politicians coming up, like Chris Murphy, who are saying, let's get back to what the Democrats do better than the Republicans, which is to try to help working people. And let's talk about that much more than we do.
Rob?
Yeah, I would say that the Democrats need to do a much better job, and I think this might have some cure for what the questioner is raising, around what kind of policies are actually going to mean something in the everyday lives of people. And I think Wendy just touched on it. You know, I think we need to put a lot more investment and attention into building up opportunities other than a 4-year college degree. And I work in the clean energy space in part of my work here, and I can tell you that I think one of the hopes is, with development of renewable energy to a much greater scale, offshore wind in particular, we're looking at huge need for welders, electricians, people that really have sophisticated skills and jobs that are going to pay well. And once you start have a party championing those aspects and creating economic opportunity for people on a real basis, then I think you can make some progress on that. So, you know, I think that, you know, I think the Republican Party is much more, at this stage, a much more narrower party than the Democratic Party is at this stage, I would argue. But I do think there's ways to sort of bridge these divides or sort of different views within the Democratic Party. But I think it really comes down to, as I said, let's pursue policies that are really going to make a practical difference in people's lives, because that'll make a difference. I will say in the side, I fully expect that, and I'm not sure if we're going to be in a recession or not, but even if we are, we will come out of it. And I think by 2024, people will be feeling better. And I think the Democrats actually have good prospects in 24, because I think that Biden's approval rating will rise as people feel better and as inflation eases, which it will, and as they feel more secure. So I actually have a pretty positive view of the future. And even if Biden is not the president, not the nominee, if he chooses not to run, I think the growing, I fully expect, as I said, a growing optimism in the country as people feel better. And who produced that for them? It's the Democrats, not the Republicans.
But Rob, let me push you a little bit on that. You represent the League of Conservation Voters. Did the LCV itself have internal debates about whether to support the Green New Deal, whether to support comprehensive climate legislation? You know, what were the wins and the victories that LCV looked for in working with the Democratic Party and its candidates as well?
Well, we certainly support more ambitious investments and programs than have been enacted, yet you have to remember where we were politically. I mean, I will give you a personal anecdote. When President Biden came to Portsmouth, New Hampshire a few months ago, I was on the rope line, and he pulled me close. He saw my LCV branding. He pulled me close, whispered in my ear, and said, "We need to get Joe Manchin religion on climate." And my first thought was, well, that's your job. But I didn't say that to him, but that was my thought. And people were texting me like, what did he say to you? So, but, you know, Manchin finally came on board. Yes, right. There were certainly things that we had to give up that we didn't like. We don't like everything that's in that bill. But when you have a 50-50 Senate and a 4-seat majority in the House, what are you going to do? Okay. You cannot, in this situation, have the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think that would be highly damaging. So we need to do a lot more. But, you know, we strongly support what was done, but we want to continue to work with allies to make sure that we get greater investments and that we do climate work and climate action and clean energy deployment ever more quickly.
Okay. Another.
Well, one other thing I just wanted to add is that my my question dovetailed into the first question, which was these policies that I'm talking about energize the youth vote.
Sure.
So by not accepting these as massively high planks of the Democratic Party, you are alienating the youth vote in the party. And I think the two are inextricably linked. That was the other point I was going to make.
Absolutely. Another, Phil Robertson, have a question?
Actually, I have two questions.
Great.
First question is actually, since I'm expecting that Trump, I think Bob Fitz is right, that Trump has got such an ego on him that he can't but announce that he's going to run, and he'll announce it tomorrow in Mar-a-Lago, and that will then dominate the news cycle, which of course makes him excited. I guess, is the result of this election mean that we're going to see the end of election denialism out in the hinterlands? I mean, are we going to actually? I mean, it seems that policy failed, but is this going to go away? I mean, will people finally acknowledge in some parts of the country that Joe Biden won the 2020 election? And then the second part of it, actually, and this is more for Bob, is like now with Biden having a wind behind his sails, what are we going to see from him in terms of changes in foreign policy? Are we going to see more work, for instance, like what he was saying in Egypt? Are we going to see more work on human rights? Are we going to see more work on democracy? More on trade? I'm just not sure what we're going to see, but I'd like to get your perspective.
So, great. We'll start with Professor Schiller.
Yeah, and I'm happy to yield to Bob Fitz, whose presentation, by the way, was spectacular. And I have to teach American politics, and I think, wow, that is a great slide deck that I would love to have. So I'm going to just address the first part and just say that as long as Trump is breathing and speaking and in the national media, he will complain that 2020 was stolen. He will never abandon the big lie. It's a book, actually, a new book by Jonathan Lemire of Politico and MSNBC. He's got a big book about how that happened. And Kerry Lake, let's not talk about, Arizona may have declared for the Senate, but the governor's race in Arizona is pivotal to this particular question. Kerry Lake is an election denier. Kerry Lake is photogenic. She's a sort of Trump model politician, and she is behind by about 36,000 votes now, but she could catch up. There's a lot of outstanding votes to be counted. We'll probably have a much better idea tonight whether she's got a chance to keep that, win that seat. If she's the governor of Arizona, that amplifies Trump's megaphone on this question and election denial all over the country, and it becomes very destructive and complicated for the Democrats, particularly President Biden and anybody else, to try to run the country when that megaphone is so amplified. If she loses, however, then I think it's harder for Trump to make this argument across the country, and I think he'll just pivot, he'll switch gears and just say, Biden's bad, I'm good, vote for me. But that election in Arizona is really integral to answering your question. I think we won't know the answer to that until we see how that election is resolved.
Okay,
No,
Rob,
I agree.
on the first
Kerry
part.
Lake is, I think she's a dangerous person. And in part, I think she's dangerous because she's telegenic and a good communicator for things that I deeply disagree with, yet she communicates them well when I step back and look at it objectively, unfortunately. No, I think that you're going to have, I don't really know what the percentage is. I don't know, maybe 30% or so of people that they don't care. This is it. This is what they've been fed. This is what they believe. And there's no amount of evidence. It doesn't matter. It's going to change their mind. This is what they believe. They believe it sincerely and deeply. But I don't think that's a winning proposition for the Republican Party. And I don't think that going with a narrow majority, let's call it, 220, 215, maybe at the end of the day in the House. Yeah, they can launch investigations, but that's all they're going to do. They can't do anything else. Biden holds a veto pen. Nobody has votes to override anything. And he holds the Senate anyway, so in the House. So I think the Republicans actually run a risk of overreach in terms of that. Do people really want to hear about that for 2 years? I don't think so. I think, I would have said before the election that it would be complete deadlock. I think actually one of the things that Biden will be able to accomplish in the Senate is a lot more judges. And this story doesn't get reported enough, but he's been highly successful in terms of the judiciary below the Supreme Court, and he will continue to do that. So a lot of progressive judges that have been put in place in the last number of years, and that will continue. And who knows? Maybe there is a Supreme Court vacancy in the next 2 years, and Democrats have the Senate. So we'll see how that shakes out.
Ambassador Fitz, for the first and second parts of that question.
Well, let me go back to the question before. As a resolute academic, this is more seems to be turning into a meeting of Democrats abroad. I worked on the Hill, and politics is a Venn diagram. And sure, you have 60-70% of the population are in favor of some type of gun control. 60%, 70%, want something done on climate. 67% want something done on, you choose it, healthcare. But it's not the same 60 or 7%. And it's not generally a single issue for the people in that 60 or 7%. Whereas, one example is obviously gun control, which is a single issue for many of the opponents of gun control, and thus was one of the reasons it's a very, very difficult issue to handle. Okay, so all of a sudden my mind is wandering. I would say that there will always be a very loyal following, it seems, in the Trump sort of people that aren't necessarily heavily engaged in politics, 30%, whatever, that will talk about the 2020 election. I think this election shows that won't sell very well nationally, and for very and a hopeful sign of the 9 people that were running in swing states for positions, Attorney Secretary of State, and whatnot, that would have some impact on elections. 8 of them have lost and have conceded. And by and large, even in Don's New Hampshire, General Bolduc, who has been very much a 2020 was a stolen election denier, he conceded, although he did it fairly ungraciously. So maybe we're coming back toward the center, what the United States has always been, that it was started as a phenomenon in the world, is peaceful transitions of power and people accepting that they lost an election.
A question from the youth wing of Democrats Abroad.
Yes.
Yay.
Hi. So I would like to touch on something that I think all of you guys mentioned in your opening statements, which was the razor-thin majority that the Republicans are projected to have. Given that razor-thin majority and the divisions within the Republican Party, or potential divisions, do you think that this razor-thin majority will make them more radical or have a more moderating effect on what they accomplish over the next 2 years?
It's interesting. If you look at the seats that the Republicans won in New York State, there were some local reasons for that. I think, in part the Democrats in New York made a mistake by trying to overreach so much on redistricting on their plan. It got rejected by the courts. If you look at those Republicans, a lot of them, I think, if they want to get reelected in 2024, they're going to be looking to be more moderate. And I would say that a number of those folks are not going to be reelected in 2024. I will predict that now. So you've got a razor-thin majority with a dynamic like that. You've got the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world. Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you recall, said that, Kevin McCarthy's going to owe me big time and he needs to give me a big role. And I have a plane coming over. Good luck with that. In terms of a national brand, that's all I can say, because I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene, as the face of the Republican Party, is particularly appealing to a broader electorate. But McCarthy's going to have his hands really full, and so we'll see what kind of dynamic develops in terms of what the demands are going to be from the Freedom Caucus folks, for example. So,
Well,
he's going to have a fun time.
But there are implications. Just and again, Bob can comment and jump in. But there are governance implications here that are very significant and severe. We have a debt ceiling. We have a huge national debt, and we issue treasury bonds all the time that people buy, and they expect to get their quarterly or their yearly dividends, and that's what the debt ceiling does. Allows us to pay those interest on our bonds that we issue, and they float the government. And the House Republicans, as they've done for more than a decade, will object and say, we're not going to pass the debt ceiling. And they're going to ask for cuts to government spending. And the budget is more than $6 trillion. I think we could probably find some places to cut. But that's where we get back to sort of the divide in the Democratic Party. Where are we willing to cut? What choices will Biden have to make? And he will have to make these choices because the Republicans will be unified on this, and they will shut the government down. This wing of the party that doesn't believe in the federal government is happy to go back and tell their constituents that they shut the government down. It's a badge of honor for them. Look at Ted Cruz. He did just fine. He shut the government down in 2011 and 2013, mostly more severely in 2013. The Republicans shut the government down in 2013, they won the Senate back in 2014. I am not so confident that because some of the extreme messages don't play or didn't play well now, that they won't get away with it to be very disruptive and destructive of the normal operations of government, much less the investigations, which I agree won't go very far. But the second problem is if Biden has to invoke executive privilege not to participate in these investigations, then we're looking at a Trump scenario where you're ignoring the rule of law. Congressional subpoenas need to be answered. Ask Steve Bannon, who's probably going to go to jail for not testifying. So, that will have to be enforced by the Democrats as well. And if the Biden administration tries not to do that, then again, we have a further unraveling of the rule of law. So I think there are pretty serious repercussions, even with a very tight majority by the Republicans. We're going to see disruption. And whether the Democrats can handle that, get around it, be creative, I don't know what they're going to do, but it's going to be very, very messy.
I would just certainly agree with that. And just note that in the Freedom Caucus, which is 1/4 of the Republicans in the House, they have an 80% rule saying if 80% of the Freedom Caucus backs anything, they all have to back it. And they can bring down the speaker at any time. Many of the members of the Freedom Caucus are what people call performative. They're in it for the show rather than to actually get things accomplished, and they frankly don't care. So I think it's going to be a pretty difficult time. And again, as I mentioned, the last two Republican leaders quit in frustration trying to deal with these people. So the dynamics are not good.
Okay, let me ask a round robin question to all three of you in shortest possible answers. Who will be the Republican nominee in 2024? Who will be the Democratic nominee in 2024? This is the 64,000 baht question. Professor Schiller.
Well, as of today, I predict that a winning ticket for the Republicans would be Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida and Governor Kim Reynolds of Iowa as a ticket. Wow. I think that would be an extraordinary ticket, and I think it would be very difficult for the Democrats to defeat. I think President Biden should run. He's the leader of the party and the leader of the free world and holds the most powerful office in the world, and you can't walk away from that. And anything less than announcing that he's running will be an abdication of that, and he can't do that. So he's got to run. I think that I think the only person right now, a couple of people that could defeat him in a primary, might be Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. And I think Pete Buttigieg is an outside chance, but I think he's got a lot of the combination things that will appeal to young people and suburban voters and middle-class voters. So that's really important. I want to make one point about 2024. The most interesting exit poll thing that I found of the whole exit poll was that women with children, married women with children, voted for the Democratic Party by 4 or 4.5 percentage points. At least that's
not for the Republicans. Right.
They voted for the Democrats. I'm sorry, for the Democrats, not for the Republicans. So suburban voters voted Republican, men voted Republican, but women with children, married women with children, voted for the Democrats. So that bulk, whoever wins for the presidency in 2024 will have to win that particular Democrat.
Rob?
Oh, Donald Trump. He will be the Republican nominee in 2024. He's going to spit these people out. as he did others, even in a field that's not as large. I have no reason to believe he's not going to be the nominee. On the Democratic side, I believe Joe Biden will announce for re-election in the spring, maybe in the winter, perhaps. If he doesn't, then I would keep your eye on people like Gretchen Whitmer, J.B. Pritzker, governor of Illinois, somebody like Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans,
Wow.
a very appealing character, who's running the infrastructure implementation right now, but a very good communicator in my mind. And that's what I think. I think, and I think Trump will be defeated in 24 if he's the nominee.
Wow. Ambassador, your predictions?
I think it would be it's very interesting to sit around and think of dream tickets for the Republicans and dream tickets for the Democrats. But yeah, how do we get there from here? And by process, it's going to be Trump. If he wants it, he's got the troops. And as I was talking earlier about the power in the primaries of the primary voters, which are the more devoted ones that actually go to the polls, I think he'll probably get it. President Biden, I think, objectively certainly deserves it. But remember, he will be 3 years older on election day than Ronald Reagan was when Reagan finally stepped down. And that will be an issue. And it will be an issue that will weigh against the Democrats. But how, if he wants it, I think he'll get it, barring some accident. But other than that, I think I'd like to think of Pete Buttigieg as a vice president.
Yes.
I don't think he
yes.
could. I don't think he could manage the presidency. Not now, sometime in the future, but he would be a good candidate.
Good.
He's just incredibly articulate.
That was my
Attractive.
vote in the primary, so who knows? Professor Schiller, do you have to leave us? Do you have any?
I do. I apologize. I have another appointment. My workday begins pretty soon, so I wanted to say thank you. This was great. I really wish I could stay, and I hope you invite me back for next time.
Great, and I hope you come
Good
visit
to see
us.
you, Mandy.
Huh? You too, Rob. Long
Yeah.
time no see.
I'll
See you
send you an
later.
email.
They know
Yeah.
each other. It's amazing. And Professor Schiller, I hope you visit us in person at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a couple of years. If I get a sabbatical, I'll make
Good.
the journey.
Excellent.
See you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Professor
Bye.
Schiller.
Bye.
So this is sort of part 2 of our own dialogue, and we can probably make it more of a question and answer aimed directly at Ambassador Fitz and also at Rob. But I'm really hoping, since Rob is at the COP 27 and Ambassador Fitz has a good sense of the, 3 different summits that are going on in Southeast Asia as we speak, that we can think a little bit right now about U.S. foreign policy and what does it count for? Does the election make it easier for President Biden to sell his message, whether it's in Sharm el Sheikh or in Denpasar, Bali, Indonesia? So, Rob, you want to give us a sense from the desert?
I will, and thanks, because my battery, I think, is not going to last too much longer, so that's good. Thank you. So I got here on Friday, and today was the first day I actually got into the blue zone, and I went to a couple of sessions with the Americas All In. I used to be, so it's a collection of U.S. Policymakers that are making large climate investments. That includes, business people and elected officials and so forth. I guess to answer the broader question, I did not attend President Biden's speech on Friday, although I was here. I was actually at another event with some members of Congress. But I think the sense of it is that you might have seen that President Biden apologized for the United States withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. I think it's highly significant that the United States brought to this conference a legislative accomplishment. no matter how imperfect it is, and as much as we want more, it is highly significant in its own way, in its own right, in terms of the investments that we make, because it allows us to put something real on the table. And unlike previous efforts, such as the Clean Power Plan, that were accomplished through executive order, which can be easily reversed and challenged in courts, which certainly was the fate of that, it gives us a larger sense of credibility. That said, when a country does something like that, and it is significant, then I think it ups the pressure. Like, okay, you did that. Let's be more significant. Let's do more. And President Biden was the target of some of that discussion and pushback during his speech and after here in Egypt. But I think that, again, going back to legislative politics in the United States and the ability to get things done through a legislative channel, I don't see a lot of follow-on that will be necessarily successful, particularly because of the House. But I think what really is going to make the difference is implementation of what has been passed with both the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, to make it real to people, like, what does it mean for me that we have more investments in clean energy? And what does it mean to me that my roads are, I can drive down my road and I have a pothole? I think, things like that will make a difference. But I think that, the United States overall is a much better position of credibility to push other nations to be here. Now, leaders of Russia and China are not here, as you know, I think you know. And certainly the war, Ukraine overshadows a lot of discussion here in terms of energy supply and how that fits into what we need to do on a global scale. So I'll have a much better sense in a few days as I spend a lot more time talking to people and going to events. I'm speaking at an event on Wednesday evening around the sort of local aspects of clean energy implementation. I served on the city council in Concord, New Hampshire for 14 years. I stepped off last year. But I still remain to chair the Energy and Environment Committee for the City of Concord. So that's part of my responsibility as a delegate for ICLEI USA, International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. That's what that stands for. And that's formally my affiliation here. Although I do see some other LCB friends in Egypt.
Good. Very good.
So,
Ambassador Fitz, what about the Asia side of?
Well, certainly by holding the Senate, that makes it much easier for a president to conduct foreign policy, treaties and whatnot. But you have to look at the practicalities. And well, I didn't mean but. Well, first off, in our particular region, clearly President Biden will continue to pay attention to ASEAN. ASEAN's centrality, which translates to you can have meetings with ASEAN as the center where you can meet Xi Jinping and other, not Putin because he's not coming. But it is really a good venue. And he understands what George Shultz was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, spoke about ASEAN and said it's important to tend the garden. President Biden has gone to both ASEAN leaders meetings when he was president and has invited all the ASEAN leaders once to Washington for a separate meeting. President Trump only went to the first ASEAN meeting in Manila and made a very, very brief speech. But clearly, Biden will understand it's important to tend the garden, and he will be out here. But also, the U.S. has other concerns in the region, which he will raise with ASEAN members. He mentioned in Phnom Penh the concern, U.S. concern with events in Myanmar, and implying, of course, the U.S. concern also that ASEAN members were not taking many effective steps. Those of you that follow the ASEAN affairs will understand why, and those that follow Thai affairs will understand. But I know Thailand has an enormous relationship with Myanmar, long border, and why they can't just energetically intervene. And it's also important to say the U.S.-Thai relationship encompasses far more than just what the current issues of the day are, Myanmar, Ukraine, China, but it's trade, investment, tourism, and ongoing security cooperation, health programs. It's a very broad thing. So I don't want to just focus on issues that may come up. Yep. That said, China, given the election, it's clear that China will be an increasing focus of U.S. policy in the Asia-Pacific. COVID-19, crackdown on Hong Kong civil rights, military threats of Taiwan, and China's tacit report for the war in Ukraine have really energized not just the U.S. administration, but the U.S. Congress. The one thing that Republicans, and it seems the one thing the Republicans and Democrats can agree on in Congress is China and the difficulties of China. And as a matter of fact, it seems often that they're trying to see who can be tougher on China. The probable next Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has already said, as soon as I become Speaker, I will visit Taiwan. Now that's going to be, as you recall what happened when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, this will be even worse. And that will get the Chinese very excited and will run things on down the road. So Xi Jinping met today in Bali with President Biden. Atmospherics were good on the reports I've heard. I mean, Biden spoke publicly about the need to stop competition from becoming into conflict, and President Xi said the current situation is not in anyone's interest and we have to change it. That's fine. We'll see how it goes. But I do suspect that we will hear more and more about China in the future of U.S. relations with the region, with the caveat that, as I started, that the relationship is not only about discussing problems, but it's just so much broader.
We have lost our speaker because his phone battery died in Egypt. But are there any?
Well, I've got a
good
kind of a realpolitik question for the former
Okay.
ambassador.
Okay.
Which when when Trump won, it was the death of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had its flaws, but my general understanding of that is the whole TPP was designed to stop what's happening now, which was throwing Southeast Asian countries into the arms of China.
right?
Correct. I would agree with that.
And by the TPP not taking effect, we're getting
Right.
a stronger Chinese presence
So what are we doing
in
about
Southeast
that?
Asia. So
Well,
what are we gonna do to kind of create the intent of TPP without if we're not going to go back to it, how can we stop
Well, first,
that current trend from happening?
First, I should know a lot more about it than I do, but TPP is not in effect with the U.S. It's in effect with the other members of TPP. And the modalities of it would make it very, very difficult for the U.S. to negotiate new members. Very difficult to rejoin. And I suspect the realities of the politics in Washington mean that that just would not happen, just could not happen. But the U.S. is constructing other alliances. It's not on trade. I should know more, but certainly security. You have the Quad, and the U.S. is organizing groups that will have an impact in Southeast Asia. On trade, I think it's largely still bilateral. I don't see any prospect of moving toward a multilateral. But there,
by not joining TPP, we've handed China a lot of cards.
I certainly would agree, and China has been playing those cards, and then in true Southeast Asian fashion, some people in Southeast Asia are getting a little nervous about that. So it's not, they are not just going to move in. I mean, you have very, very different reactions in Laos and Cambodia, Myanmar, than you do in Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia.
My wife is Thai, and she's anxious about how much influence China seems to be garnering in Thailand.
Well, certainly they're working hard at it. I would just point to the fabled China-Thai high-speed railroad and how slow it's proceeding. I think the Thai are a little bit more realistic about moving too close to China, what that means.
Jeff, did you have a?
I'm trying to remember what you were the ambassador to.
Oh, I was Papua New Guinea, some small islands, Vanuatu, wonderful place, Solomon Islands.
That's what I thought.
Very wealthy islands.
Question ties into that. I watched Australia in 2020, and a few months ago, I believe they did something dealing with Papua New Guinea that the Chinese are investing, want to build a port, want to build like a tourist area, an airport, and things like that. And there's concern with Australia that they're going to do that, that China is
Sure.
taking much bigger steps towards Australia. Now, when they interviewed the president of Papua New Guinea, he basically didn't say he supported it, but he didn't say he did with the Chinese. So I wonder what the American response is and how they're dealing with Papua New Guinea, and then what our dealings are with Australia to try to prevent this. Because certainly the spread of Chinese influence over Asia, now Oceania, is a major problem. So I don't know what you think of that.
Well, one of the joys of being ambassador to Papua New Guinea is the students don't tear up the shrubbery around your embassy. They go to the Australian embassy. Because the Australians are the overwhelming, they were the colonial power,
They're the
and
colony.
they had the largest presence. They're paying a very large portion of the government expenditures. So they have that influence and they're resented. We're talking privately to the Papua New Guineans. I don't know that what exactly we're proposing. I'm not in that loop. Of just as much significance as the Solomon Islands, where the Chinese have reached a real agreement, and they're doing things which I would say wildly unthinkingly. Like they're training local police, but they're thinking of stationing Chinese police in Solomon Islands to protect some Chinese interests. Well, in the Solomon Islands, when the politics starts to get bad, they go down and burn Chinatown, and China's going to probably find that its reputation or its repute in the Solomon Island population goes down pretty quickly when their police start getting involved. It's a prickly area of the world, but I do not know what precisely we're doing, but I'm sure we're talking to them. And we regularly have some minor military cooperation. We have port visits and whatnot. Solomon Islands, by the way, after they had the agreement with China, all of a sudden they stopped allowing U.S. port visits. It's ongoing.
Please, you're a journalist, Jeff.
Nukes.
Well, with nukes, yes. But if we keep allowing China to go forward, at what point are we going to hit when we try to stop? It's going to be too late. I mean, it's
Okay, well, first, China, I would add to with nukes, they also have gas and oil. And that's enormously complicating the entire situation. On China putting our foot down, well, I'm not sure exactly how we put our foot down. For a long time, and through at least the first Obama administration, most analysts thought that as China opens up, as it has more trade and more investment, it will inevitably create a middle class which will change the internal dynamics. That's not happening, obviously. They're going their own way. And much of this is probably beyond our ability to influence. They have an increasingly authoritarian state. I mean, it's go on with the social scores, and there are limits to that. You can see there's some resistance to the COVID, to their strict COVID policy, but they're increasingly withdrawing, I think, within themselves, and we will not have that much influence. We can talk to countries about what they can do with us. Most of the countries out here want to continue. Some will say, some will not, but they all want a continued U.S. security presence here because they're somewhat nervous. As Sweden and Finland all of a sudden decided to join NATO because of what happened in Ukraine, I suspect as China continues to throw its weight around, as I expect it will, I would expect that the local people will all of a sudden be more interested in a countervailing presence. But as far as the U.S. standing up and telling China no more, I don't think that's in the cards. I don't think we could. And the dynamics of it are that China will slice the salami and will do only enough. At what point do you say no? So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. I don't have an answer for it.
Okay, we've got a last question.
If I can jump in.
There we go. Okay. You can use the microphone if you want, or you can chat.
We can hear it.
Do it.
The point where we could have said no was around 2012, 2013 in the South China Sea. We could have sent Coast Guard ships. We could have prevented the militarization of, fire across streams, Spratly Islands. They are now armed. Short of war, there's no dislodging the fact that presence and dominance of the Chinese in the South China Sea. So I would agree with the ambassador. With China, we have a competitor, I don't want to say adversary, around whom we cannot get our arms, neither economically nor militarily.
True.
And that's a new thing for the United States.
I would agree.
Yes. Chris, I want to hear it.
Yeah, so my question is about the recent emerging economic problems happening in China, particularly about real estate and the impact that's having on their construction. Given that a lot of their foreign policy with One Belt, One Road or building ports is, assuming seems to require the participation of construction companies, how do you think that this crisis, economic crisis, is going to affect their ability to continue to do this?
A couple points. First, if you look at the literature since 2008, China's been in crisis. It's going to happen tomorrow. They're going to crash. I think the Chinese Communist Party is extraordinarily resilient. They have economic controls that other countries could envy, but no one's got. They can build up industries like their tech industries and then cut them off at the knees because the central government has that kind of power. They have economic, they're not fully integrated with the world. The world economy, the exchange rate is not flexible. The world economy can't drag them down. There's enormous, in Western terms, enormous debt problems in the construction industries and in the many of the local governments and in the Chinese state companies. But they've been able to manage most of that. As my understanding is they're taking a second look at the Belt and Road Initiative and scaling back what they're doing, both in reaction to like in Sri Lanka, the difficulties the local governments are getting into and not going to be able to repay, and then the foreign policy kickback if they start taking over ports and whatnot. They'll scale back, they will readjust, but I would caution you when you read that China's going to collapse tomorrow, or the whole economy's going to implode. That's not going to happen. What's more scary to me, when we were talking, I didn't mention South China Sea, but salami tactics. What happens when Speaker McCarthy visits Taiwan? They will do some of the same thing, but might do more. What do we do if they were to cut Taiwan off from the internet, which they could do? I mean, permanently, not just for a week or so. What about some kind of blockade? What about, there's ways they can put a lot of pressure on Taiwan, and at some point, are we the frog in the pot that's just not going to pay attention? But at some point, what are we going to do? They'd be extraordinarily foolish to invade, and I don't think they're ready to do that, not even by 2027 or what the current date is. But they can do an awful lot in which we might not be able to help. It's going to be a problem.
Short question, yeah?
There were a few things written when China responded to Speaker Pelosi's visit that in the region made them a bit nervous. I mean, they get sort of the smiling face of China. Unlike its neighbors, Thailand can float its own bond offerings, it can finance its own infrastructure. It doesn't need China to help it. And it's the slowdown of the high-speed rail. But the region generally gets a fairly beneficent presentation from China. And they own an incredible amount of media here, besides the fact that they give their wire service away for free. Mm-hmm. So there's a Chinese soft power is quite effective, I would say, in some ways here. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering how you assess that. Was that wishful thinking that the Chinese made folks in the region nervous by their behavior towards Taiwan? Have you seen the effect of that? So I had no way of, I guess, reality checking the articles that I read that were opining that was the case.
Certainly Japan and South Korea noticed and were taken aback. And you'll notice that Japan is really reassessing the resources it's putting into its military and its military doctrine and whatnot, which was already underway, but that was sped up by what they did in Taiwan. I have no links really in Vietnam. I know Indonesia took an interest and thought about it a bit. There's various overlapping claims with Indonesia and the idea that China might aggressively assert itself is being considered. Malaysia, I don't really know. Thailand, I don't detect it. It's just, Chinese are good, they've got money, we need investment, and half of our elite is, substantially Chinese. Although, interestingly enough, I do detect, and some of you have been here longer than me and are more deeply integrated, but the Sino-Thai elite are the reason why there's resistance, some resistance to foreign investors owning land and whatnot, because it's the Chinese that are going to buy our land, and we don't want them. But I don't think they were worried about Taiwan. You know, Taiwan's a long ways away, and China's not a threat to us.
Exactly. Tom Van Blarkum, can I offer you the last words of the evening?
Just listening.
Can I ask you a question that you have to answer? In 5 years' time, will there be more or less American multinationals invested in Thailand? And then the same for China firms, American firms.
I would say probably less American, probably more Chinese.
That's the easy way out. All right.
Well, on that, I just note that in American business circles, I hear more and more ABC, you know, anywhere but China, concerned with
They need to
restrictions
move
within
out.
China, need to invest someplace else.
Yeah.
But I suspect that will be Indonesia, Vietnam, in the region, not necessarily Thailand.
Why is that? Let me ask.
It's just, people tell me it's easier to get things done. There's the workforce in Vietnam. They have a very good manual labor, not manual labor, you know, trained technical people, welders and stuff like that. You can get things done. Whereas here, everyone wants, you know, it's more difficult to get skilled non-executive work. It's, if I thought a little bit, I could be a little more articulate on that, but it's, yeah.
That explains a lot.
Last thoughts, last questions? No? Thank you all very much for coming. And this was the hardy, the few, the proud, the brave, the rainy night Monday specialists. Do we have any? What FCCT events are coming up, Phil, that we need to? I don't have schedule with me, but. Is there anything this week? Take the mic. Hello.
Hi, I'm Phil Robertson with the FCC. I'm a board member of the FCCT. So, if you haven't had a chance to join the FCCT, you can. There are membership forms that you sign up. It's a great club. Get into all events free. You also get 20% off your bill. It's a super opportunity, and I encourage everyone to join the FCCT. Thank you.
I'll let my membership lapse. I'm going to have to re-up at some point.